The funny thing about the advertising industry is that if you break the rules long enough, your practices become the new rules. This is my conversation with John Follis. What if the truth came in a gel cap and we could just pop it in our mouths and forget about it? Well, it doesn't, and we can't. But we can laugh in the face of reality while plotting our survival. Welcome to the Truth Tastes Funny podcast. I am your host, Hirsch Redpun, and if my guests can handle the truth, so can you. Open wide, folks. Here it comes. My guest today is John Follis, an advertising industry legend who in his career has bested Smuckers along with a few schmucks. And for listeners seeking to do well in this world as humans and as business people, you would do well to listen in today. John, welcome to Truth Tastes Funny.
Hey, glad to be here, Hirsch. Thanks for having me.
John, like me, you're an alumnus of School of Visual Arts in New York?
Yeah. I took a couple of night classes at SVA, but graduated Syracuse University and went through their advertising program. I took it very seriously, and the first advertising class I took, like Advertising 101, which was taught by a guy from New York who would come up to teach, did not go well. And it was kind of a shock because any creative class I'd taken throughout my academic career, I did extremely well in, but not in this class. And I couldn't figure out why, other than the fact that I didn't really like the instructor a whole lot. I just thought he was really arrogant. And, you know, that's not a reason not to do well in the class. He basically gave me an option. He said, you're not doing well in the class, and I'm going to give you a choice. You can either drop the class right now or stick it out for the next 3.5 weeks and take the grade that I'm going to give you. And I can't tell you what that grade is going to be, but I can tell you you're not going to be happy about it. So it really wasn't much of a choice. And I asked him if I could think about it. He said, yeah, you got 24 hours. Let me know tomorrow what you want to do. And it was like someone throwing a glass of cold water on my face, because I had always done throughout my schooling, I had always done well in any kind of creative class. And this was a shock. And as I was walking out the door, he gave me one last piece of advice, which was do not go into advertising.
So which is a very specific insult. Yeah. It's like a very specific kind of, almost as a threat to you. Like, you know, don't you dare sully the industry of advertising with your lousy shit that you...
Right. And when you hear that from someone who actually works on Madison Avenue and you're just a humble student, you take those words pretty seriously. You take them to heart. I certainly did. The problem was I was more than halfway through my college education. My dad was spending some pretty big bucks on my tuition, and I was faced with the fact that I was being told that I suck at the career that I had recently decided I was going to pursue. So, you know, what do you do now? And that's what I had to think about over Christmas break. And because I really didn't have a plan B, I looked through the curriculum and found out that there were a couple of other instructors teaching the same class. And I kind of thought this guy was an asshole, and I was hoping it was as much about him than it was about my talent. So with that hope, I took the same class with a different instructor and got an A-.
Right. Well, there it is right there. You sometimes know in your heart. Like, I think you would have known if he was... I always tell my kids that if somebody gives you advice and your reaction is, yeah, you know, I agree with it, that's right, then follow it. If your reaction is, that's bullshit, they don't know what they're talking about, then probably your barometer, you know, assuming you have decent judgment, your barometer is probably good on that. Good advice tells you oftentimes what you already know, but you just aren't seeing.
I was just starting my curriculum in advertising, so admittedly, I didn't know a lot about advertising. And this, as I mentioned, this guy was a professional who was in the business, who would come up each week to teach his class in advertising. Why he would want to do that, I don't know. But he clearly knew a lot about the business, and I assumed he knew what he was talking about when he told me not to go into advertising. So it wasn't so easy to think that he was wrong. And from my way to help determine that was try it with a different instructor.
Yeah. So now, what kind of background did you come from? What did your parents do?
Well, I had kind of an interesting upbringing in that my dad was a business guy, an entrepreneur, and my mom was an art teacher.
Oh.
Which makes a good combination for someone to go into the advertising business.
Yeah.
My mom only taught a couple years before she got married and pregnant, so her student turned out to be me and my sisters, her students. So I think that having that influence from my earliest memory is what formed me as a creative person. It certainly helped having my mom throw me a box of crayons when I'm 3 years old and say, draw something and show me what you did, and, giving me praise when I did that, and putting my stuff up on the refrigerator. So, that developed me at the earliest age to be a creative person, and why I did so well throughout my academic career up to that point. And, so that one experience was kind of an aberration with that instructor, but it was a really good lesson for me to learn looking back on it, because as you know, you're going to come across people in your career that for whatever reason you just lock horns with. And it may be less a reflection on your talents or abilities than it is on the relationship with that person and the personality issues you have with them. So, those personality issues throughout my career are things that I had to learn how to deal with. And, like I said, I was fired multiple times, 4 times in the first 7 or 8 years of my career. So that college experience was just kind of a foreboding of what was to come.
So what did you think? So let's jump ahead. So let's say you landed. Where was the first place that you worked in advertising?
Well, I was afraid of New York growing up, and it was kind of sacrilegious to graduate Syracuse with a degree in advertising and not go to New York City. But I'm not a city boy. I grew up in Connecticut, in a kind of a rural area of Connecticut, and New York's scared the crap out of me, to be honest. Fortunately, one of my instructors had worked in Atlanta for a few years and had some connections there. So his advice to me was, you're crazy for not going to New York, but if you want to go to New York, if you want to go to Atlanta, I got some names for you. So I and a couple of my classmates took that advice and moved down to Atlanta. And that's where I started out my career, working for a division of BBDO down there. And I hated it. My first job, I was in production doing things that I didn't want to do and really didn't know how to do, simply because that was their philosophy. They didn't hire a kid out of school to be in any kind of a decision-making capacity as a creative person. They just didn't believe that we knew enough to do that, and they stuck me in the production, which I suffered through for a year and a half until I said, screw this, and quit and moved to Chicago.
Where in Chicago did you land?
I landed at the headquarters of Foot Cone Belding.
Okay.
So, big time, finally.
So that's big, yeah.
Hit the big time in Chicago, and lasted there about a year and a half before I got canned.
We were talking a little bit before the interview about where our backgrounds kind of cross over or kind of missed each other. But I always enjoyed writing copy, but I ended up in a niche where I kind of innovated the PR aspect of PR for production and post, but I stayed away from the creative part, the copywriting part. And I would go to all these agencies as a rep, Wells Rich Green and BBDO New York and every agency,
right,
but never think I wanted to be part of those gigantic enterprises. Like I was both awed and deterred somehow.
Right.
And when I think about what you were attempting to do and what you were hitting walls with, I wonder if it were similar things that I would have faced the corporate infrastructure? Like,
Yeah.
what was it at FCB that?
It was steeped in politics. I mean, when I was doing production in Atlanta, I was under the radar there because I was just a peon. But
Yeah.
suddenly in Chicago, I was dealing with big egos and creative directors and international accounts, and it was the big time. And I just was not prepared for dealing with the egos and the politics of the big agency world. And I was pretty naive looking back. And, you either sink or swim in that environment. And as you said in the introduction to this podcast, I just thought that if I was talented creatively, that would be enough to enable me to be successful in that environment. And I quickly realized that I was wrong, because there were a lot of my fellow creatives who I'd seen go up the corporate ladder who were really mediocre creatively, but they had a gift for, maneuvering themselves there, among the personalities at the agency in order to not just survive, but to work themselves up the ladder.
Yeah.
And I really, I don't know if that's something you learn or you know about inherently, but I didn't have that ability, nor did I really want to focus my energies on trying to figure out how to do that. I just hoped that at some agency would appreciate me for my creative talent and continue to get fired.
Well, in a way, you make a good point, which is that if you're kind of a journeyman creative and you don't mind just being given stuff and you turn it out, and then the creative director or the executive creative director goes and does the battles and fights the battles, you get to be creative, but you won't advance. You'll just stay in that slot, right? As opposed to if you want to be an ECD or a group creative director, you're going to have to be a political animal.
And I had trouble keeping my mouth shut. I mean, listen, there's bullshit in every industry, but I think advertising has extra bullshit when it comes to stuff like that, because so much of it is based on people's opinions. When you're judging an ad, whether it's good or bad, it's often based on whatever your creative director thinks is good or bad. And sometimes when he makes some comments that you think just don't make a lot of sense, you either have to, keep your mouth shut about it and swallow it, or you have to speak up about it and try to defend yourself and argue why you think, your idea makes sense. And again, that's where I got into trouble, because I had trouble keeping my mouth shut when I was exposed to some of this. And learned pretty quickly that that's not going to enable you to do well in that environment.
What was the next step?
I got picked up by a small agency where instead of being one of 100 creative people, I was one of 3 creative people, or maybe 200 at FCB. There's maybe 200 or 300. I mean, the agency had about 1,500 people there. So there were, there was a bunch of creative people, and suddenly I'm at a small agency that was kind of a startup. I think the whole agency had maybe 9 or 10 people, and I was one of 2 or 3 creative people. So all of a sudden I had to perform and do a lot of stuff that I was still, maybe, so I had maybe a year and a half experience at FCB as a creative person. And now I'm in a small agency where I'm exposed to things at a small agency that I never would be exposed to at a big agency. So there was a whole new set of challenges. But the difference, Hirsch, was that my success there was a lot less based on my political skills than it was on my ability to perform as a creative person.
Did you have a creative partner?
I did. I did. Yeah. I started out as an art director, but I was always a very verbally thinking, writing art director. At Syracuse, they made a point that you can't just focus, when you're an advertising person, you had to think conceptually and be able to think about what is the main message you have to get across and come up with a headline, things like that. So I was always very good at writing. I never really, when you're working with a writer, you don't have to rely on your writing skills so much. But at this small agency, because we were both doing, the writer would think graphically and I would think verbally oftentimes. And so, yeah, I did have a partner. He was a very talented writer. And we did well together. That was one of the few agencies I did not get fired from. And they were actually sorry to see me leave after about a year and a half. I learned so much being in that small agency environment, and felt after that experience that I had the confidence to give New York a shot.
Oh, so in that case, your confidence was bolstered. You had a really good creative collaboration going. And so did an opportunity open up in New York, or you decided to go pursue it?
Like I did both in Atlanta and Chicago, I just felt I needed to be there. I had a friend of mine who was living in New York and said that he had an opening for a roommate. And I think getting a place to live in New York is almost as hard as finding a job there. So that's what I did. And because I had some pretty good produced work, having worked at the smaller agency, I thought I would get a job in a few weeks of looking. And 4 or 5 months later, and still not finding work, I was beginning to wonder if I would ever get hired. And that's when I started. I had people tell me, well, your work is okay, but you ought to consider going back, taking some courses at SVA, which is not what you want to hear when you've been in the business for 5 or 6 years at that point.
No.
To go back to school, right? But that's what I did. I ended up, it's kind of funny. So I said, one of the guys who said, go back to SVA, I said, well, can you recommend any particular instructors to take? And he recommended an instructor that required me to present him with a portfolio before he decided whether or not I was worthy to take his class.
Ah, okay.
Which was kind of a eye-opening experience. So I went up to his agency to present my portfolio to see if it was good enough to take his class, and he ended up offering me a job.
Awesome. Which agency was this?
Terrible agency. Terrible agency. I don't even remember the name of it now. It was a terrible agency whose biggest account was Carlton Cigarettes.
Okay. All right.
And that was the job offer I got, to be an assistant art director on a cigarette account.
Okay.
Really exciting stuff.
Right. And so was that essentially print, or were they allowed to do any broadcast?
No, it was primarily print, and it was again another terrible job, but it was a job in New York.
Yeah.
And
yeah,
I every day that I was at that job was more motivation to leave that job for a real job, a better job. I mean, I hate cigarettes. And I just felt like, after 5 or 6 months of looking for work, I was not in a position to say no. I had rent to pay. But fortunately, again, another job that I did not get. My career was, leave a job, get fired from a job, leave a job, get fired from a job. That's the way it was for the first 7 or 8 years of my career. And again, fortunately, after not a long time, I don't think I was there at that job for even a year, because I was aggressively trying to find a better job. I did find another job and left that job.
Right. So we have now that's 4 agencies, but that's only 3. There's 2 firings. And were you fired from this shitty?
Well, I was fired
agency
from FCB, so that was my first firing. Left the second Chicago job, left the first New York job to my second New York job, which I got fired from.
Okay.
So the job that I went to after that cigarette agency, I got fired from. And then I got fired from 2 more jobs after that in New York.
But let's give the audience a reward for hanging in there through these firings. And essentially what did happen ultimately was you realized or you had the opportunity to create your own, to
Well,
create an agency in which you were
yeah, I was
a
getting
partner.
fired, Hirsch, but I was getting fired from increasingly better agencies.
Right. Okay. Good. You
Like
were firing up.
yeah,
You were getting fired
like
up.
Doyle Dane Burnback, which I'm sure you're
Oh
familiar with.
yeah. Yeah.
And that's back when Doyle Dane was still one of the best agencies, not just in New York, but in the country. I was working on the VW account, and they,
Yep.
that was legend. Their VW work from the 60s and 70s was
Yeah,
one
the
of the
Beetle.
reasons I got into the business. I mean, at a certain point, after getting fired as many times, I was having trouble getting interviews at agencies because I had talked to all of them, and I was forced to go through the phone book. I remember one day I was going through the phone book when people, I don't know if people listening know what a phone book is, but I was going through the phone book calling agencies to try to talk myself into getting an interview. And I remember one day I made 106 phone calls and got 103 rejections, which meant I got 3 interviews.
Yeah.
And it was at one of those interviews that actually was a major factor in turning my career around. So, really, at a certain point, it really comes down to how much you really want to do it, how much you're willing to put in despite the challenges you face, to just not give up and keep trying. Well, one of the interviews I got was with a young guy who was doing business development. And he was actually a partner in the agency. I think he was a year or two younger than me. At the time, I was probably 30, and he was like 27. And he looked at my portfolio and was really impressed with the work. And his response was, listen, we don't have an opening for you now. And he said, quite honestly, I don't know that you'd want to work at this agency because it's not that great. I was surprised that he was so honest about it. But he said, I'm going to hold on to your resume, and I have a feeling we'll be talking again at some point. I don't know when, but I have a feeling our paths are going to cross again. And then about a little over 2 years later, I got a call out of the blue from this guy. He had long since left the agency that I met him at and was freelancing with another guy. His name was John Bond, and the guy that he was working with was a guy named Richard Kirschenbaum. And I don't know if the name Kirschenbaum and Bond means anything.
Kirschenbaum and Bond, yeah.
Okay. So you know it. And again, at the time, these were just 2 guys that were working together. And John, who was the account guy, said, I'm working with a young guy. We've just been collaborating for a few months, but we're pitching business. And I think Richard could really use the creative services of someone like yourself. So I said, I'd like you to meet him. And for the next year and a half, I worked with the 2 of them, mainly on an account called Kenneth Cole, which at the time no one knew because Kenneth Cole was just starting his business. But the ads that we created for him were really getting attention because we didn't show shoes. We didn't show a big logo. They were just really witty ads of Kenneth Cole's perception on current events and somehow tying current events into shoes, which is where the creativity came in. And that's why they stood out, because they didn't look or sound like ads. And after 6 months of doing these, they would run every couple of months in New York Magazine, and people started wondering who was doing these ads. I started picking up freelance work, and eventually got a call from a guy who introduced himself as a new business guy who was referred to me by John Bond. And this guy was looking for a creative guy because he wanted to pitch business the way John and Richard were pitching business. And 20 minutes after meeting me, said we should start an agency. To which I replied, what's your name again? Yeah. And that eventually led to the forming of our agency, which was called Follis and Verdi, and eventually Follis DeVito Verdi.
Yeah.
Ellis was an amazing new business guy. I mean, how he got business meetings with clients, I don't, he was just an amazingly smooth talking, door kicking guy who could talk his way into anything. And so we made a really good team because I was really good both at the writing and the art direction. I was ambidextrous in that. And all I needed was the opportunity to do some creative work, and we would usually blow the doors off of, whatever other agencies we were competing against, one of which was a competition for a product I had never heard of called Sorrell Ridge Jam that was a healthy all-fruit jam. And in 1988, healthy jam was a new thing. And they were competing against the jam that everyone knew about, Smuckers jam. And we were told when we met with the client if we wanted to do something competitive against Smuckers, because everyone knew Smuckers. Mm-hmm. And he gave us an education in jam and told us that Smuckers jam was 90% refined sugar and high fructose corn syrup with
Right.
8% real fruit. And he said, our jam is 100% fruit and fruit juice. So, we've got a very competitive story to tell. So we said, yeah, absolutely, we want to go competitive against Smuckers. The question was, how do you do that? Everyone, the American public, not only knew the name Smuckers, but it was like mom and apple pie and Smuckers. Their commercials were your grandparents and puppy dogs and things like that. So we had to do it in a way that we had to, walk that delicate line by saying why we're better without being mean-spirited about it. And that's where,
Mm-hmm.
some creativity came in, and we did a commercial that basically dismantled the Smuckers tagline, saying with a name like Smuckers, it doesn't have to be good.
Oh wow!
Because
Yeah.
it's like David and Goliath, and the heart of Goliath was their tagline, because for 40 years they had been just forcing that tagline in the minds of the American consumer, and that's where their equity was. So we felt with one
Right.
stone to throw, that was the target, their tagline, because it was bullshit. It was a
Yeah.
bullshit.
And it hit.
Yeah, it was
And it
it was
hit.
memorable. It was fondly thought of by the American consumer, but in line with your podcast, there wasn't a lot of truth to it.
Yeah.
And so this was a case where we could actually be really, really truthful with our advertising and make a strong case for why people should choose Sorrell Ridge over Smuckers. And sales went up 90% the first month, and for the year went up over 50%. So his $350,000 advertising budget for 3 months turned into $1 million advertising budget, because he saw such a direct result in the first few months of the TV spots that he was doing with sales. And that's rarely a case where, unless you're doing a direct response campaign where you see such a direct response to the money
Yeah.
you're spending and the sales that you're getting. But in this case, he was seeing a direct result, and just started scratch and scrape for every dollar he could find, and it turned a $350,000 budget into a $1 million budget. And that account put our agency on the map.
Now this was, and you also won a ton of awards. The all important, I wanted to bring this up because for that campaign, you won top awards. You were featured in ADWEEK and all the magazines and all that stuff. And it's interesting that in that industry, awards, it's the same as for the TV. It's the same as for like entertainment with
Right.
the Golden Globes and the Oscars and the Emmys. But in the ad business, there's this fascination till this day with awards. We just came off of the Cannes, Advertising
Right.
Fest being back.
Right.
But what is that fascination?
Well, because it's a business based on creativity. And creativity, when done well, can increase sales. That's the connection. You go from,
Yeah.
not everything that's award winning does that. So some clients are impressed with creative awards, and many of them aren't. What all clients are impressed by are how well you sold your client's product. So as much as it was exciting to be able to showcase the awards that I've won, what was more impressive about the Sorrell Ridge case was the fact that the Harvard Business Review made it a case study. When
Yeah.
you tell that to clients, then then they start getting impressed, right?
The agencies don't really want the light shined on the creatives that much, because then the creatives become more valuable and they quit, or they have to be paid more money. So for the agencies, you're right. The Harvard Review is a much more saleable thing to have.
Well, it depends on the agency, Hirsch. The creative agencies, the top agencies that I wanted to work for, were proud of the fact that their creatives won awards.
Yeah.
Because they wanted to attract more clients based on that. It's kind of self-fulfilling. If you got clients that value creative work, and they come to your agency and you do great creative work for them that works, then it's a way to showcase the abilities of your agencies and grow your agency based on a creative reputation. So some agencies really valued the fact that, they were creative driven agencies that really valued creativity. And then there were other agencies like Gray and other ones that you know of that would not use that as a lead story to promote their agency. Because you could grow an agency and make a lot of money with clients that don't necessarily win awards for creative work.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's the other side of it, is that, it's a business. That's the bottom line with everything, is that, and this is another question for you, through all of your adventures, where do you shake out on the philosophical reality, the reality that, business is business. We are in the business of selling a product. We're in the business of selling an image, or we're in the business of moving units and earning market share. How should we feel about our contribution if we're a creative person in the picture of
one
that?
of the agencies that I worked for was Doyle Dane Bernbach, who the creative leader of that agency was a guy named Bill Bernbach. You may know the name. So he was one of the so-called legends in advertising. And he was a business guy, but he was one of those business guys that believed that creativity was the heart and soul of the advertising business. And one of his quotes touched on the question you just asked. He said, the creative person, creativity is not about verbal gymnastics and graphic acrobatics. The creative person in this business who is successful has learned to harness his creativity. So he makes, with every photograph he takes, with every word he writes, he makes more vivid, more compelling the story that he wants to tell about his product. So it's the ability to harness that creative energy and channel it with sound, strategic thinking, so it helps sell the product. Because at the end of the day, as you said, it's about sales. Best example, Hirsch, that I can give of what I just explained was what we did for Sorrell Ridge. And if you search Sorrell Ridge ad campaign, you can find it online on Vimeo because I posted it. But it started out with, as I mentioned, the target that we were throwing the stone at, the heart of Smuckers equity, was their tagline. So we had 30 seconds. It was a 30-second commercial. We had to tell our story in 27 seconds. So I started the commercial with the Smuckers tagline filling the screen. As the announcer says, for years, Smuckers has been telling you they have to be good, but did you know their jam is made with mostly corn syrup, refined sugar, and not a lot of fruit? And every time the announcer referenced one of these bad ingredients that goes into a jar of Smuckers preserves, the pair of hands would pop up from below the screen where it said, with a name like Smuckers, it has to be good. The last line at the bottom said it has to be good. In matching typeface, it's not so good. It's really not so good. And I forget what we wanted to say. It sucks, but the lawyers wouldn't allow us to say with a name like Smuckers, it sucks. But it
Suckers.
Progressively,
Smuckers has you figured for suckers.
It progressively dismantled the tagline as the voiceover read each ingredient that goes into Smuckers. And then we did a shot of the beauty shot of the Sorrell Ridge jar surrounded by fruit. As the announcer says, fortunately there's something better. Sorrell Ridge with 100% fruit and fruit juice, 100% fruit and fruit juice. With a name like Sorrell Ridge, it has to be better. And so we kind of played off of the Smuckers tagline with our tagline with a name like with Sorrell Ridge, it has to be better. So it was very simple, strategically did, but very creative in that we showed the Smuckers tagline and actually literally dismantled it in real time as we were talking about what goes into Smuckers. So that was a combination of creativity with disciplined creativity with sound strategic thinking behind it.
Yeah, how did Smuckers react?
Well, our big fear was that they could sue us. And, imagine the PR you would be getting for this.
And they're going to have to prove, I would imagine, that what you said wasn't true, right, which then calls more attention to their own
absolutely
lies. Whereas if they don't sue you, they can just say, that's just a cheap shot, whatever. They can say anything.
They're going to try to sue you for defamation or whatever, but talk to your own lawyers and ask them if they think that Smuckers would have a strong case for defamation, because basically what you're saying, as much as it might ruffle their feathers and piss them off, you're not saying anything that's not true.
Now, back then, when truth came up against fiction, there was some barometer that we could use to differentiate between fact and fiction. These days, a lot of people will say we live in a post-truth environment where the truth is relative, alternative facts, fake news, all of that shit. So, circling back around to the ups and downs of the industry, and this was certainly a high point and set in motion a period of, incredible productivity and thriving as a creative. What succeeded that run?
We brought Sal on and changed the name to Follis DeVito Verdi. So we just continued picking up business and growing our agency. And I, in a 3-year period, I won something like 36 awards, which was pretty validating after getting fired as many times as I had by other agencies and really questioning my creative talent, especially reflecting back on that Syracuse University experience where I was told that I had no talent. So it was a nice validation. Eventually, I had to confront my business partner, who I felt was breaching our partnership contract, and break up the agency, which was very unfortunate, I think. When I first met him, I thought I was really glad that he was on my side until I realized he wasn't. And had to confront him with some things and eventually take some legal action. And it forced me to split up the agency and go solo, which was pretty scary because I didn't think I could survive without a business partner. And ended up doing that for a few years. But the interesting timing of that, Hirsch, was that that was right around the time that the internet became a thing. So I was intrigued with that, put up my first website in 1996 and started paying attention to that, and eventually started. I was one of the first people in 2004 to start an online marketing consulting business via Skype, where I was doing this with business owners around the country, giving them marketing consulting, which often turned into specific projects. Out of the consulting, we would determine maybe they needed a TV commercial, maybe they needed a better website, maybe they needed a tagline, whatever it was they needed, that turned into specific projects that I was able to offer a dedicated fee for doing that project. So I did that for over 10 years as a consultant, and then got involved in more digital video, started something, a Big Idea Video in 2013, which was dedicated digital video, which at that point, I was pretty good at creating, was able to offer that to a lot of clients who had websites, but just needed a lot more compelling video as well.
Right. Well, the consulting that you describe is interestingly kind of what I'm doing now, because what I realize is a lot of people don't know what they want or need. They know something's missing, something in their message, something
Right.
in there. It all begins. Also, I feel creatively, to a great extent, we're reactors. We react to a problem, or most often a problem, or we react to an idea that they have about who they are and
Sure.
what they want to say, and we go from there. So to put it out, to just be a writer for hire or a creative for hire sometimes misses a step, right? Unless they have an in-house market, CMO, or somebody that, that really has a vision for the creative. But really, I find that sitting down with people and working with them on something simple, some small statement or some small document or project, is a good way to open up the door to what it is they really need, and then they can hire me to create what they need.
It's all about developing a relationship. And I would find myself at networking events, and if I introduced myself as an advertising guy, they wouldn't want to talk to me. But if I said that I'm a marketing expert, then that opened the door for conversations about some of the things that were happening at the time, the digital media. So I realized that they were just looking for someone that they could trust, that could help guide them about that. And I just realized I had to figure out a way to get myself in front of these people and figure out a way to charge them for my expertise. And half the time I felt like a therapist talking to these people, because their businesses were so emotionally wrapped up in their business, as any small business owner is. So I decided to brand myself as a marketing therapist, as kind of a unique catchphrase to get them curious about what I did. When I was at a networking event, the last thing I wanted to say was, "Oh, I'm a marketing consultant." That's like, you're a business coach. I didn't want so.
It sounds so dry, and it's not what we do.
It's a commodity. It sounds like a commodity.
And the therapy thing, I would call myself a message therapist, but I think people would read it wrong most of the time and assume that was a typo, and then come to me to give them back rubs, and that could either be disastrous or delightful.
I found out that at these networking events, which is what I would spend a lot of time trying to stir up some interest, if I said, when people ask you what you do, you've got 3 seconds to respond to that. And what you say in those 3 seconds are either going to get them to want to continue talking to you, or excuse themselves to talk to someone else or get a drink. So I found that if I said, "Well, I'm a marketing therapist," at least they would say, "Excuse me."
Right.
I didn't quite get that. You're what? And so that's again, that's what enabled me to get into a conversation. And then it was kind of a fun way to brand myself. On my business card, I had a picture of a couch, and I called it Follis Marketing Therapy. And then I could build around content, do podcasts, and do creative digital content that got into exactly what marketing therapy was about. So it became fun. It became a fun brand to kind of build off of. And that's what enabled me to, to build my own brand. And, we talk about brand building, how to stand out. So you don't position yourself as a commodity. How do you stand out? And it was based on my own experience of talking to these people, because I did feel like, it was part marketing advice and part therapy. And, one of the things I volunteered early years ago, I was on a telephone crisis line where they put you through 50 hours of training dealing with people who in some cases are suicidal. So you have to know how to talk to these people, and more importantly, know how to listen to these people. because if you don't say the right thing, they're going to jump off a bridge, right? Or jump out of their window. So that really trained me how to listen to people, really kind of get to the pain point, get to the core of what these people, you know, as you referenced earlier, right, with your experience of talking to people. And a lot of marketing people aren't so good at listening. They're very good at talking. So I would start out, if I could engage them in some marketing therapy, I would just start asking them some questions and get them to talk about, so I could really hone in, as you referenced earlier, of what was really at the heart of what they were struggling with. And sometimes what they thought the problem was really not the problem that they should be focused on. Again, the other problem, Hirsch, is that these people are so enmeshed with their own business, they don't have the ability to stand back and look at it objectively. And that's what I was able to bring to them and give them an honest, objective perspective that they really appreciated, you know?
Perspective is in large part what we bring. So before we go, let me ask you, at this moment in your adventure, what brings you the greatest joy?
You mean right now? Or having conversations like this, to be honest with you, because I've done a couple of creative projects, one of which I shared with you, a series called True Stories in Advertising, which I know you will get a kick out of. And I also made a documentary, which was really a fun, exciting challenge. Doing other things that give me personal satisfaction, but I miss having conversations about the career that I spent 35 years of my life doing. So to talk to anyone who might value anything I have to share in a conversation like this, to me, is a lot of fun. So, you know, since I discovered Podmatch about 6 months ago, I've been having a lot of fun talking with people who host podcasts on various things related to business or career or marketing or overcoming challenges, you know, any number of flavors that relate to my personal experience in my career, and talking to people around the world, many of them, you know, overseas. To me, it's just a lot of fun, you know, to share anything that might inform or inspire or encourage other people in whatever they're doing, you know?
I hope my audience gets a lot out of this one, because there is so much that people need in terms of resources, help, perspective, like you said. You know, we're very close to our own lives, and a little perspective is always a good thing. Oh, what did this person do? You know, how did they deal with that? The challenge for any
podcaster like yourself is the same challenge that I had, that I described when I started doing marketing consulting. I mean, there's so many podcasters, just like there were so many marketing consultants. The question then becomes, well, how do you distinguish yourself, right? Especially with the pandemic, Hirsch. I think the number of podcasters have grown, you know, 20-fold in the past 2 years. Everyone and their grandmother now has a podcast. And the question is, how do you build an audience, right?
My strategy is to go on as many grandmothers' podcasts as I can, and hopefully cross promote with their audience.
I don't think I told you this, but I started learning about podcasting in 2005, and by February of 2006
We should definitely chat for a minute about your experience with in the early days of podcasting, which weren't that long ago. But what was it like?
I loved it. I mean, for the same reasons you seem to be enjoying it. I just thought it was the most amazing thing that you could sit in front of your computer. When I discovered podcasting, a light bulb went over my head and said, I wonder if I could use this as a very juicy worm to put on a hook to try to get business owners to talk to me. because I'm not gonna do what I did when I was looking for work, in 1980,
Right.
88, going through the phone book anymore. But if I send an email from my virtual assistant inviting them to be a guest on my podcast, where allowing them to talk about their business for 30 minutes, maybe that would allow me to develop a rapport with these guys and eventually maybe get some business out of it. So that was my thinking. So I did that for about 7 years until I just realized that it had kind of run its course. And
I was wondering
after that point,
if I use the term message therapist, whether I would be appropriating your marketing therapy moniker, or whether there would be enough of a difference that it would be okay to use it. You have to.
I'll have to call my lawyers, Hirsch, and see.
We have to call the Smuckers legal team and figure out.
Well, you can, if you go to follisinc.com, you will see a link that says need marketing help. And if you click on that option, you will see how I presented my marketing therapy when I put that up in 2004. So, the look of it is pretty dated. It looks like it was put up in 2004. I'd give it a facelift if I was doing it today, but at least you can see what I was doing back then.
Well, that's the funny thing, is that we're all we have to, at some point, even though we're in the business of helping other brands and other individuals and entrepreneurs brand themselves and message themselves, we have to have a reckoning with ourselves in terms of how we package our services. And sometimes it's the hardest thing. It's like, doctor, heal thyself,
I have to tell you, the people who were worst at branding and marketing themselves were other marketing people. And all of them, I wrote an article. I said, your most important client is you. I wrote that article 20 years ago. And basically it was me, thinking about what we're discussing and just reminding myself why my business is I am my most important client, and had to really focus, number one, all my marketing talent, my creativity toward my own business, my own brand, and do that. Because that's the first thing that any prospective client is going to be looking at when they decide whether or not they want to pay me, $300 an hour for my services.
We're only as strong as our weakest link when it comes to promoting ourselves. Being on, this is a really fun, kind of wide-ranging conversation.
I appreciate it. It was really good. Like I said, this is one of the things I really enjoy now, and it's not often that I come across someone who intersects in different professional ways like you and I do, which again is one reason why I'm going to ask you to let me know after you watch a couple of those true stories in advertising, just your impressions. Because as coming from your background, I'd be really, really curious what you have to say about those.
Will do. Thanks so much for tuning into Truth Tastes Funny. If you enjoyed the experience, please leave a 5-star review and share this podcast with your friends.